You know, you are absolutely correct that we cannot change the Bible to fit what we want to believe. We must conform our beliefs according to the Word of God. And the text that you brought up does not say anything about Israel being God's people permanently. And when we study the context, what we find is something very interesting. You see, God's blessings, His promises, have always been conditional on obedience. Even Adam and Eve in perfect Eden were kicked out when they disobeyed. This is not to say obedience earns us anything. It doesn't. But obedience is the fruit of love to Jesus. And in Deuteronomy 7 verse 9, what we find is that God is merciful to those who keep His covenant, to those who keep His commandments. And notice verse 12, it says, "Wherefore it shall come to pass, if you hearken to these judgments, and keep and do them." God's blessings were conditional on their obedience. We see the same thing here in Deuteronomy 28. If you will obey the voice of God, then these blessings will come. If you don't, curses will come. And in Deuteronomy 30, "Therefore choose life, that both you and your seed may live." And when we get to Daniel 9, God gave Israel a certain amount of time to get their act together. Their history was one long, sordid going back and forth between rebellion and obedience. And God finally says in Daniel 9, you have X amount of time to get your act together. And here's the thing, this prophecy here on my left centers around the Messiah. That's Jesus. Because you see in verse 24 there are 7 things listed, and only Jesus as the Messiah, as God, can accomplish any of them. So essentially what God is saying is in 483 years I'm going to send the Messiah, and if you will allow Him to, He will accomplish all of this for you. Now, as evidenced in this chart, that start date was 457 BC. So we get to AD 27, that's when Jesus was baptized. And then close to 3.5 years in, the religious leaders had this meeting here in John 11. And it's really interesting because here we see an example of what Christian nationalism looks like. Only here it was the Jewish nation. You see, they were more focused on preserving their nation than on obeying God. And in order to preserve their nation, they decided they had to kill Jesus. And my friends, modern American Christianity has fallen into the same exact trap. Modern American Christianity is so focused on preserving this nation that the groundwork for the mark of the beast is being set as we speak. Just as a sense of nationalism led the Jewish leaders to demand the death of Jesus, the same sense of nationalism is going to lead Christianity to not only demand the mark of the beast, but to persecute those who reject it. And only those who have truly accepted Jesus into the heart are considered His followers. You see, whether you're biological Israel or not is completely irrelevant in the New Testament era. And honestly, if you didn't follow Jesus wholeheartedly, it never really mattered to begin with. Because according to Paul, if you're a Jew, so what? You're not a Jew who is one outwardly, you are one who is one inwardly. Now, this is not to say that nobody from the nation of Israel can be saved. Individually, absolutely, they can join spiritual Israel. But in the sight of God, your genetic relation to anybody else does not matter. Do you love Jesus? Are you obedient to Him because you love Him? That's what matters in the sight of God, nothing else. So Paul in Romans 11 asks a question. He said, has God cast away His people? And he answers his own question, God forbid, I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So what is Paul speaking of here? Well, as we have seen in Romans 2 and Galatians 3, it's not about biological Israel, it's not about literal Israel, it's about spiritual. And so some people get confused when they come to this chapter, Romans 11. Now again, prophecy shows us that as a nation, Israel, the people of Judah specifically, rejected Jesus when He came as Messiah. The 10 northern tribes of the northern nation of Israel, God threatened them with the punishment, and He did it, of making them wanderers among the nations. The 10 northern tribes have not been a nation since they were punished with that specific discipline. And when the Jewish people stoned Stephen in 34 AD, they sealed their rejection of Jesus as well. But as individuals, no, God has not cast them off. As a people, God can no longer work through Israel or through the Jewish people. Why? Because they still reject Jesus. And as a result of that, they have suffered many manifold and multitudinous disasters in their history in the past 2,000 years. But there have been many stories, of the Apostle Paul being one of the most prime examples, of individual Jewish people coming to Jesus and accepting Him, and therefore they are not cast off. But If they refuse to accept Jesus, just like with any Gentile person, if anybody refuses to accept Jesus, that individual is cast off until they decide to accept him. And if they persist in their rejection until they either die or Jesus comes, then they are cast off eternally. You see, it has always been an issue of the heart. Just because someone claims to be an Israelite, or let's modernize it, just because someone claims to be a Christian, doesn't mean they are one. Because the principal factor is, does your heart belong to Jesus? If so, then you are a Christian and part of spiritual Israel.